The world's best brains are thinking about how to make the global economy stronger, cleaner, and fairer, so that all continents, all countries, and all people have an opportunity to prosper, access to education, healthcare, and jobs. There's general agreement that coherent government policies calling for internationally agreed rules of clean business dealings, open trade, and investment are the answer. But will this be enough to boost the economy and improve the lives of people in developed and developing countries? I'm joined by Dambisa Moyo. She's an economist and the author of the New York Times bestseller Debt Aid. And Brenda Killen. She's also an economist at the OECD and advising governments on development policies. Dambisa, the floor is yours. What do developing countries need, and does it differ radically from the needs of developed countries?
Thank you very much. And the answer is no, it does not differ radically from what people in the developed world are looking for. Fundamentally, Africans, like other places around the emerging world, are very interested in getting jobs. They want the opportunity to create income and to be able to create a path and destiny for themselves and for their future generations. I think what's critically important is that we remember that we do have a vast amount of history on what works in terms of getting economies going to grow at even double digits and meaningfully and radically put a dent in poverty. And I believe that over the past 50 years across Africa, unfortunately, we've not been able to get the policies right. There have been many, many attempts in different and varying fashions to actually reduce poverty and spur economic growth. But on the whole, we've not been able to do this in a sustainable way that has actually been had a meaningful impact. But given the population dynamics now, where over 60% of Africans are under the age of 24, it is critically important that we focus on creating jobs and ensuring that we do get the sustainable development that we're all looking for.
And Brenda, that sustainable development, how can it best come about?
Well, sustainable development is the objective of all the donors who are members of the Development Assistance Committee, and also of the new emerging donors, whether from the private sector or from countries that have been through development themselves, such as South Korea. And these countries are coming together with agreements around the Millennium Development Goals to provide assistance to developing countries in Africa to help them achieve their goals of sustainable growth, of jobs, of better health and welfare for their populations, and by learning from what's happened over the last 50 to 60 years from development elsewhere to speed that transition to sustainable development.
But what do you think needs a boost?
Well, what really needs a boost is a focus on priorities from the country itself, making aid more effective so that aid can catalyse other forms of investment. We need to see more foreign direct investment in Africa. Crucially, we need to see more trade. And in fact, one of the Millennium Development Goals that I think hasn't achieved the focus it should have done is the goal on making the international system work more fairly, particularly trade reform, so that African countries have access to trade and can grow their own way out of poverty.
Dambisa, are there parts of what Brenda has said that you agree or disagree with? Or?
Well, I mean, I don't think that we as a global community fundamentally disagree on what creates jobs and what creates growth. I think where we may quibble is on how best to get it going. So, for example, I fundamentally believe that the aid system unfortunately has imbalanced or incorrect incentives. And so, for example, I find that by and large, donors in the West in particular are incentivized to give money when perhaps they shouldn't. The recipients, on the other hand, across many African countries, are incentivized to take money rather than perhaps seek alternative ways of financing. So, for example, what tends to happen is that I believe things like the trade regimes, where in Africa we know that the tariffs remain incredibly high, or foreign direct investment is discouraged in places where it takes such a long time to get a business license. These type of things are allowed to exist because African governments, by and large, know that they can rely on the aid flows coming from Western governments. This is not to say that we can't do aid better, but it is to say that it would require a fundamental overhaul in the manner in which it's delivered and the approach which should be taken.
What would be part of that fundamental overhaul?
Well, in my book, for example, I believe that one way of getting aid to work better is if African governments understand that they are not entitled to aid, nor are aid flows permanent. I believe that the manner in which, or a policy initiative that could be instituted is perhaps one of an exit strategy. So, for example, if an African country understood that by, I don't know, 2050, they would be undergoing an aggressive and transparent and serious weaning off of the aid system, then I believe that they would be incentivized to start looking for other forms of financing for their economies. Otherwise, they'd be voted out. Right now, I believe that many African countries, from Ethiopia down to Zambia, have not implemented a number of things that they could do, not only to spur the domestic tax base, but also to create jobs and to fundamentally grow a middle class from which we could get the good, solid institutions that we so desperately are looking for.
Brenda, what about this, the idea of a finite aid?
I think that's what everybody wants, and I think the taxpayers in the donor countries who are providing aid, when they got into this relationship, didn't want it to last forever, and clearly people in African countries want to be generating their own income, want to be on their own 2 feet, want to have a seat at the top table. I think that there's been a major change in attitudes towards aid, particularly since the end of the Cold War, and there's a coalescence now around a sense of aid is about delivering development. It's not about winning friends. It's not about getting a country on one side or the other. And that there are certain rules of the game that will make aid more effective. These we have pulled together in the OECD in the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness. And that's a declaration that virtually all the countries in Africa have signed up to. One of the key aims of making aid more effective is that it can actually deliver development. It focuses on results. It is supporting the aims of the government of the country itself, and that ultimately we're working towards a situation where countries won't need aid anymore. And a lot of countries in Africa have developed their own visions for becoming middle-income countries, so they're already thinking on the track of graduating from aid in the next 20 to 30 years.
Dambisa?
Well, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I think that, of course, places like Ghana, South Africa, Botswana have actually been very vocal about and actually have implemented alternative strategies rather than just being wholly or largely aid dependent, or certainly not dependent on aid to the degree that many other African countries are, for example. But I think that we need it to be a much more significant overhaul across the attitude and the approach across the continent. And I do think that African governments need to be encouraged to start to think about weaning themselves off. I mean, my sense is that there are still pockets of the debate or the aid culture that are very resistant to even having a conversation about the notion of aid exits. It's not everyone, but I believe that we need to come together as an international community and agree that it is not in the interests of the African people, nor is it in the interests of the global community as a whole, to have a population of nearly 1 billion people who are not contributing to the global purse as much as they could be, and instead relying on external taxation to keep them propped up. I believe that by and large the aid system is a band-aid system, in the sense that it does provide healthcare, education, infrastructure, and even security. But these are public goods that ultimately we want African governments to provide to their people, and so we should be working towards that agenda.
And Brenda, the long term, the security, how long? Dambisa has said maybe to 2050. When do you think?
Well, it depends on the country, and as everybody knows, Africa is a huge continent with 53 different countries with many, many different situations. So some countries, certainly Ghana, which has already gone to international bond markets to raise capital itself. In some of the countries which have achieved middle-income country status in the past and are on their route to re-achieving that, I think for them they can look at aid being a very small part of their public expenditures within the next 10 to 15 years. But there are a number of other countries where internationally we really need to come together around finding particularly security solutions. The areas of conflict and fragility in Africa, around DRC, around Liberia, around the Horn of Africa. There are a number of issues there that need to be worked out, and they will have to be worked out internationally. It's the kind of area where the UN Security Council and other groupings at that level need to come together. But for most countries in Africa, they're making good progress. Aid is focusing on their priorities. There's much more transparency around aid, so that not just citizens in Africa, but actually the taxpayers in donor countries, for whom they should know that this is good public expenditure and it's being provided according to the guidelines of best practice that are encapsulated in the Paris Declaration. They're on a track to graduating. I think 2050 is entirely plausible. But what would really speed this up would be if we looked at the international system, and in particular if we looked at access to trade.
Dambisa, last word to you. You're optimistic about the future of Africa?
I'm very optimistic, and I guess all I would say is that we should do what we know works. I think that we, as global policymakers and the global people who discuss global development issues, we get an A for theory, but where Africa is concerned, we get an F for implementation. I think that we know that we need more trade, we need more foreign direct investment, but as I said earlier, what tends to happen is that on these very key policy aspects, African governments are not delivering as much as they should and as much as they could. And I think herein lies the responsibility of not just African governments, because this is not just an African problem, this is a global problem, and we as international citizens should all be concerned and should all participate in actually meaningfully putting a dent in poverty and transforming the continent once and for all.
Dambisa Moyo and Brenda Killen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you.